Sawadee Kap, and welcome back. I'm Brian from Beervana, and this is Beer History, Episode 3, the modern era of craft beer. Ni pit madra samsip song mai. Today we're going to move from the birth of styles in Europe over to the New World in America. As European beer styles were created from the early spread of beer from the Fertile Crescent, we have the same kind of thing happening where American beer styles were created from European beer. Brewers moved from England and Holland across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World, and they brought their beer traditions with them. As the population of America grew, they knew that they needed beer. Beer was already popular in Europe and the Old World, and they found that America was a pretty good place for making beer. They discovered that hops grow really well in the climate of New York, and so does barley and wheat. So the ingredients to make beer were readily available in the New World. Of course, they started by making the same styles of beer that they had in England and Holland. Traditionally ales at this time from Western Europe. Ales were faster and easier to produce and didn't require long, cold lagering time. So early American beers were most likely ales, produced by British and Dutch brewers in what is today New York, but at that time was New Amsterdam. In the 1600s, on record, they had about 26 brew pubs, taverns, and brewing operations in New York. It grew very quick from there as the colonies developed and America started growing the beer with them to every city. And it was obvious that beer was going to be the drink of America. Many small breweries existed at this time, and also people were basically home brewing, just producing beer in the household. Essentially, beer was a locally produced product that beer didn't travel well at this time, and it was kept in wooden barrels. Bottling in glass bottles was very expensive. So most breweries used wooden barrels, and beer was consumed on site at the brewery or the tavern. People wanted to take beer home, they would have to carry it in a wooden bucket. It's okay if you live nearby, but it's not very practical. After the Civil War, at around 1850 or so, beer started to change significantly in the American beer history. Immigrants came from all over the world. Specifically, Eastern European immigrants started arriving in America. Germans, Austrians, and with them they brought their love of lager and their recipes for brewing lager-style beers. German breweries that we know today, such as Miller, Budweiser, PBR, or Pabst Blue Ribbon, these were all founded in the mid-1800s. All of them in the American Midwest, around Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. And this is where America really fell in love with lager and Pilsner style beers. A few other things changed around this time. The Industrial Revolution was just taking off, and some changes that made beer production easier. So we started seeing refrigeration, the beginning of the lagers dominating the American beer scene. Soon after, we had cheaper, better bottling capabilities, so people could bottle their beer and send it. And as well as the aluminum can came in not too much later, in the early 1900s. These changes, these technological advances, and changes in consumer preference. When German brewers started making lager, it was clean and crisp, and it spread throughout the country, and soon enough, lager beer became the most popular style of beer in the USA. Another advancement was pasteurization, which allowed beer to travel longer and to prevent infection. So some of these advances really changed the beer landscape in America. For a while, lager was the dominating flavor of beer, and it continues to this day. Another growing movement in America during this time, you have the Industrial Revolution, as well as the Prohibition and temperance movement. We had the Prohibition movement in the early 1900s. It's a time when America decided to make all alcohol illegal. Not the consumption of alcohol or the possession, but the production. So people who had a large quantity of alcohol in their wine cellar or who had stockpiled it were able to continue drinking it. This was Prohibition, and at the time it was an experiment that came out of a religious movement. A lot of people who thought that the hard drinking spirits, the high alcohol spirits and the heavy drinking caused a lot of problems. Problems at home, problems with their families, and industrial accidents. It was also a time when women got the right to vote. For the first time in American history, women were allowed to vote in general elections. And I hate to say it, but there were a lot of angry women. Angry women led the Prohibition movement. They had the right to vote. They were not happy with their drunken husbands and all the accidents that were happening, and they decided to push for the abolition or the banishment of all alcohol. And they won. From 1919 until 1933, America decided to make alcohol illegal. But the people weren't having it. People were making beer at home. They were causing accidents by blowing up their house when they're making gin or vodka in a homemade still. During Prohibition, the mafia came to power because they knew that people wanted beer and whiskey and other spirits, and there was no way to stop it. Canada, for example, was still making whiskey. So the mafia grew by importing whiskey illegally from Canada, buying homemade bootlegged whiskey from Kentucky and Tennessee, and this gave rise to the speakeasy, one of the most popular bar styles that we still see today. The speakeasy was traditionally a secret bar that would be behind something like a soda fountain, a milkshake shop, a barber shop, and you would knock on the door and be allowed into the secret room where you could drink alcohol. These flourished all over the cities in America, especially cities that were controlled by the mafia. Al Capone opened several speakeasies in Chicago. And during this time, a lot of people went to jail for drinking beer. A lot of people were killed for drinking alcohol. The mafia, the mobs were fighting each other for the control of the alcohol and the money that it provided. I think the American authorities quickly learned that making alcohol illegal was a failed experiment. And they were protesting openly. There was a protest in New York City on May 14th, 1932, called the Great Beer Parade. It's a famous photograph of people holding up signs that say, "We want beer." 100,000 people marched through New York City chanting, "We want beer," because they knew that beer was not the drink of the devil. It wasn't Satan's water. It was just beer. And that people liked beer and enjoyed beer, and it shouldn't be illegal. Other countries around the world have experimented with banning alcohol, and I think that it's pretty obvious that it doesn't work. So we went from hundreds of American breweries in 1919 to only a few after 1933. Only the big guys who had enough money could survive the Prohibition period. After Prohibition, a lot of the breweries were not able to come back. They had suffered being closed for 20 years. Many of them just went out of business. The big breweries that somehow were able to come back, most of them were allowed to produce beer under the medical alcohol license. People could get a license or a permit from their doctor to consume medical beer or medical alcohol. So some of the breweries were allowed to stay open. But overall, from the 3,500 breweries that were operating in the late 1800s, America went down to about 31 breweries after Prohibition. And this big beer culture, industrialized beer, started to dominate the landscape. Lager became the most popular style of beer because of the early influence of immigrants and Eastern European beer styles. At the same time, we had refrigeration, better highways, trains and trucks that could bring beer to people. So the country was craving beer, and what they got was a mass-produced commercial lager that was refrigerated, and it would taste the same pretty much anywhere in the country. Also, the invention of canned beer. In the 1930s, the aluminum can became a viable and affordable vessel for beer. This changed the way that Americans drank beer. Instead of drinking at the bar and the pub, they were able to take beer home for the first time. So they could buy cans of beer at the grocery store and drink it at home. This completely changed the landscape of beer drinking. This big beer dominated the scene for quite a few years. From 1933, when Prohibition ended, until about the 60s, these beers were refreshing, they were crisp, they were light in color, they were very easy to drink, and honestly, they were boring. This is why the craft beer revolution started. When craft beer started in the craft beer revolution, the late 60s, early 70s, in the 70s and going into the 80s, there was a health craze in America. Everyone was into fitness. They were doing aerobics, jogging for the first time. They were listening to Olivia Newton-John and dancing around the park. And this also made people want to drink light beer. Light beer was perceived as being lower calories and more healthy. So from maybe 1970 into the 80s, we had a beer landscape that was incredibly boring, incredibly low flavored, no hop, boring beer. Throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, America was defined by mass market, commercially produced, boring beer. Budweiser, Miller, Coors, lagers and light lagers that didn't satisfy people who had tried real beer. Around the early 70s, a man named Fritz Maytag, the heir to the Maytag appliance fortune. His father was famous for making washers and dryers and refrigerators. So Fritz Maytag was a guy who had a bunch of money and wanted to do something different. He found a brewery in San Francisco called Anchor Brewing was for sale, and he decided to buy it and make beer that tasted like some of the beers he had tried on trips around the world. And a lot of these homebrewers ended up opening breweries. If you look at Stone, Sierra Nevada, Anderson Valley, a lot of these breweries began with homebrewers who started making beer as a hobby and then took their hobby to become their passion and eventually their business. Homebrewing became legal in the United States for the first time, which allowed the passion and the creativity of the American homebrewer to flourish. People started making the beer that they wanted to drink. This is a good example of kind of American independence and ingenuity. People wanted to share something special and unique with their friends and family, and it was beer. The American homebrewers grew an incredible culture that survives today, which is also influencing the craft beer world. It was an American brewer making a new style of beer that was similar to European styles and was full of flavor. At the same time, in the mid-70s, the Cascade hop, one of the iconic, most famous American hops, came to be recognized and sold on the market. It was developed by the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, and the University of Oregon, Oregon State University. They developed the Cascade hop and found that these flavors worked really well in new styles of beer. Thus, the American Pale Ale was created. There were several breweries. Anchor Brewing in San Francisco was using the Cascade hop in some of its beers. Another brewery called New Albion started in Sonoma County, California. And they were famous for being the first brew pub or microbrewery in America. A little bit later, Ken Grossman started the Sierra Nevada Brewery, making his iconic Sierra Nevada Pale Ale with the Cascade hop. So around this time, people got a taste, a desire for full flavored beers, hoppy beers, bitter beers. Out of the American West Coast, we found pale ales, and then later IPAs. Truly bitter, new styles of what had previously been European style beers. Americans took pale ale, IPA, stout, and even Belgian sours and took them to the next level. In very classic American style, they broke all the rules. They decided there are no traditions. The American tradition is breaking tradition. So they threw away everything that they learned about what these styles should be and said, let's add more hops. let's double the alcohol, let's double the hops. For the next few years, in the 80s, 90s, and up until today, we've experienced a complete revolution of craft beer. At the same time, Americans have led the way, in my opinion, for craft beer revolution. They had the balls to make beer different. They went into crazy new directions. They decided to make double IPAs, triple IPAs, quadruple IPAs that are 10, 11, 12% alcohol, full of more hops than anyone had ever put in a beer. They also went into stouts, started making barrel-aged stouts, whiskey barrel-aged, pastry stouts that are popular today, throwing in everything from donuts to pizza and all kinds of crazy ingredients into a beer, just to push the limits, just to see what's possible. A lot of these beers became popular. People thought they knew what beer was, but these American brewers changed their minds. They made crazy sour beers with local yeast and local fruit, and they made them well. And today, we're lucky enough to be enjoying this craft beer revolution. American styles that were influenced by European styles have now gone back to Europe and spread all over the world. Breweries all over the world are making extreme beers, wild beers. You could find a craft brewery probably in every beer-making country around the world. And in those countries, you'll find an extreme craft brewery. Someone who's making pastry stouts, someone who's making a Neapolitan ice cream or bacon maple syrup into a beer. The craft beer revolution is ongoing. It's changing every day. The styles of beer that we have today are amazing. Nobody would believe that we would have beer like this, and it's changing every day. I'm very excited to see what the next steps of craft beer are going to be, and happy to be on this journey enjoying beer with you. So here we are today in 2020, and craft beer has spread throughout the world. There's amazing breweries in almost every country making local beers that are sour, that are bitter, that are pastry stouts. I've had some sour fruit beers from Russia, some pastry stouts from Amsterdam. These are the beers that have been influenced by the American craft beer revolution, which has spread to every country that makes beer. Here in Thailand, we have over 1,000 different varieties of amazing craft beer currently available today. And there's no stopping this beer revolution. It will continue. Beer is going to go into space. Beer is going to go to the moon, going to go to Mars. There are new types of genetic engineered yeast that will make the flavors of hops. Soon enough, yeast will make every part of the beer flavor from just the yeast. We won't need hops anymore. We won't need malt. I'm talking about the beer that Elon Musk is going to 3D print on Mars. Beer is here to stay. Beer has been here long before we understood it. And beer will be here long after we're gone. Kapun Kap. That was episode 3, The Modern Era of Craft Beer. Please join us for episode 4, The Future of Beer.